Okay, so it's really a great thrill to introduce Dr. Rob Akins from Nemours, who I think everybody knows. He doesn't need an introduction if he gets one anyway. He's a local boy from Westchester. He went to the University of Pennsylvania undergraduate, got his PhD there as well. Is a world-class expert in tissue engineering and is leading that effort at Nemours. He has appointments as full professor at Jefferson and affiliate full professor in biological sciences and in engineering at the University of Delaware. He's a research leader on the INBRE grant and is also very heavily involved in the Delaware CTR, where he's leading the education and mentoring KCA. His own grant portfolio and publication track record are really outstanding, much too much for me to possibly go over. Hopefully, at least I understand some. It's really a great pleasure today to introduce our terrific colleague from Nemours, one of the leaders in science in the state, Rob Akins.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you very much. And thanks for everybody being here and online. The talk today is about mentorship, which is one of my passions. But I do have research also, which I would love to talk to you guys about offline or doing these events. Our current research in the regenerative tissue engineering, regenerative therapies lab focuses on biomaterials for post-surgical recovery after vascular surgeries, especially after vein graft surgery. And we're moving into preclinical trials with some biomaterials, abluminal biomaterials. And we have another relatively large project looking at innervation in patients that have static encephalopathies and how we might be able to help with peripheral nervous system affects in those patients. But I also, for a long time, I've had a passion for mentorship, and I'd like to talk to you about that today, the role of mentorship in research, especially in clinical and translational research. And Seema, just to a nod to Seema, we flipped a coin. We were sort of halves of this project that's moving forward in Delaware, and I won, so I'm giving the talk on mentorship. I have no conflicts to report. I wish I did. The primary sources, in case I forget, the data and sort of some of the slides that I'll show you, a lot comes from Sally Rocky, who just announced yesterday that she's retiring. NIH, AAAS, AAMC. We have a physician mentoring program up at Nemours, and I'll reference some of the things that we're doing up there. Mark Chimowitz, who is part of the CTR grant, he's from Medical University of South Carolina, and a nationally recognized expert in mentoring programs and their development. And then there's individual publications on the slides. And what I'd like to do as a preview of why we're talking about this in the Innovative Discoveries session, and there's a couple of sides to the facets of why I wanted to talk about this. Give some definitions about mentoring and what we're talking about. Talk about the models and infrastructure that people are developing. Go into some best practices that have evolved and are continuing to evolve nationally and in Delaware. And then talk about evaluation, which is one of the issues that I really wanted to bring up with this group, and sort of start the ball rolling and thinking about mentoring and education programs as interventions. How do we test the effectiveness of interventions and make sure they're cost effective? And then give you a list of resources. And Sarah Faye has my slides, and they're available on the CTR website. You guys are welcome to use them. So why are we talking about this? And we all know that initiating and sustaining research is becoming increasingly difficult, especially for clinical and translational researchers. Associations with hospitals, medical academic institutions, and medical schools is getting harder and harder to get started and sustain research. And there's two general reasons, and I'll show you some data and then sort of loop back to these two reasons. But junior investigators are navigating increasingly complicated landscapes. NIH pay lines are difficult. It's not unusual to have single-digit percentiles being funded these days. Study sections sometimes random, and sometimes the vagaries of what information you get back from study sections, and even editors from journals are, to me anyway, more and more sort of difficult to deal with, especially in this time of so little resources. Publishing procedures have become complicated. They're still struggling with tenure and advancement, and in clinical environments, the RVU pressure is just ratcheting up for everybody. At the same time, senior investigators are more strapped for time as well. Same thing, limited resources. I find myself spending more time writing grants. In the last week, I submitted 3. In the last month, I submitted 4 than I used to have to. And it's just because the success rate is so low. I spend more time writing grants trying to sustain the research than used to be really necessary. And the senior researchers want to focus on their own research. So the interactions between senior and junior researchers have become more difficult. Let's look at some data. Bill knows I'm kind of a data geek, but the data that are available around this whole story of mentoring and its effectiveness are somewhat limited. But NIH, and in particular Sally Rocky, been taking a look over the past few years at success rates for new investigators and resubmissions and sustaining investigators. So I want to show you some of that information, which I think colors our consideration about with mentoring. So what you're looking at is a graph on the y-axis. That's the age of getting your first R01. That's kind of the gold standard for NIH funding. It means you've made it, you're an independent investigator. And across the x-axis, and I'm sorry if you can't read this, are dates, 1980 on the left up to 2012. And you can see a very steady and continuous increase in the age at first R01. Right now, the average age, the colors, MD PhDs are in blue, MDs are the orange color, PhD onlys are green. It started to flatten out a little bit, but MDs, and in particular, this little blip when funding got really tight, or MD PhDs even popped up. So the average age for MD getting a first R01 is now 45 years old. We're just a couple decades ago, it was in the mid-30s. So if you, also from the NIH, and this perhaps a little more complicated. So now the y-axis are the number of new and experienced investigators. So the numbers on the left are percentages on the right. And the blue are the established investigators, the red are new investigators, and the column graphs refer to the left. So those are just numbers. What I wanted to draw your attention to is the green line, which is the percent of these new and competing awards that are going to new investigators. And there's a general decline down until the mid-2000s, 2005. A few things happened in 2005, but you see this sort of nice increase, which is what we want to try to push new investigators back up. And these data are up to 2012. I don't know if 13, 14 data are out yet. And then sort of a drop back down. So these make it look a little bit more reasonable. These are pushing new investigators back up. But in reality, that increase is because of the ratio and the fact that you get a decrease in established investigators sort of falling out of the program. So I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing if you're sort of draining out the senior mentoring kind of pool and funding more people on the new investigator side. But at least the trend looks. Sorry for the yellow. These are directly off of other people's slides. So those were both from NIH. This is from AAAS. And this is the total, not just new and competing, but the total number of R01s that are funded. And again, that number's been going up and up. This doesn't take into account buying power, or sort of the value of an R01, which has been going down. It's just straight numbers. But the thing that's interesting and is possibly a concern, we plateaued again in the 2000s. But last year, and this is last year being 2013 for the data, we lost 1,000 NIH investigators, and the initial looks at current data, that decline is continuing. People are just unable to get funded or leaving their NIH-funded programs. And this is AAAS from last year. They did this analysis in Science. And finally, I'll try to encourage you more later. I'm going to deal with that first. If you look at, this is again from Sally Rocky, if you look at the age, so on the left axis is the percent of all principal investigators. Y-axis is years again from 1980 on, and the graphs are showing you the percent in blue of PIs who are age 36 and younger, and in red are 66 and older. And our percentage now for sort of young new investigators tied to that first graph that I showed you is low, 3%. So historically low. and increases in age 66 and older. And there's nothing, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. Those are senior people that are sustaining their programs. But we have a lot of senior people that are getting toward retirement age. And because of the decrease over time and new investigators coming in, there's actually this sort of dearth. I'm sorry, I forgot about this one. There's this sort of dearth of new mentors that are coming in, mid-level investigators that are taking on the responsibilities. Or a little out of sequence, but this is a sort of Kaplan-Meier curve or analysis looking at retention. And again, it's not great news. What the analysis was really about is looking at 3 different cohorts. So now y-axis is percent of people that get their continuing, get an R01, do you get the next one? And then how many years after their first R01 does that happen? So as you would expect, not everybody resubmit after their first R01. They realize it wasn't what they wanted to do, and they're not very successful. These cohorts are really about the economics behind what NIH is trying to do. So in the middle case, so in the 1997 case, there's actually increases in funding, and in fact, around that time, an almost doubling of the NIH budget, with earmarks in sort of directed funds for new investigators, but their dropout rate's essentially the same as in 2 other cohorts where funding was much more difficult. And they sort of put these lines around when the resubmission came in and what the funding environment was then. So the take-home was the funding environment doesn't seem to be affecting it so much, but maybe there's something else going on.
So if anything, it looks like the 19
97's orange, 2003 is that light green, and 89 is blue.
Which is the one from the year where where the funding became a little bit easier?
Well, 2003 is the ARRAC funding came in, and so the middle one. The middle one. Yeah. So
I mean, you might think that what would happen is if the funding becomes easier at the time of first R01, you'd end up with more marginal people.
Yeah.
So that you actually may have a higher dropout rate.
Yeah. So
people who had any difficult years.
And that's an excellent point. So when they they looked at it that way first, and then they recalibrated so the increased availability of funding correlates with the resubmission. So they got in when it was harder, but they're still dropping out. The new recipients aren't able to get read. So with these data, you can parse these things a lot of different ways. And one of the things I really want to communicate to this group is these analyses are sort of cursory, and it's still unclear exactly what's going on. But there's a generally well-appreciated recognition from NIH's perspective that all these things they're trying to get new investigators, young investigators funded, aren't necessarily helping at all. And if they are, it's just marginally. And on top of that, we have other kind of economic problems that are building. So the concern in the mentoring community is what's going to happen over the next 5 years. If we start getting people funded now with changes in the economics in healthcare, how do we make sure we can maintain some level of success or even improve success in our institutions in Delaware? So those data, and getting back to those 2 points I made, junior investigators have more work to do, and senior investigators are more strapped and less able to help. So it's increasingly difficult, and it's getting worse for junior investigators. But the other thing I wanted to add is that we're seeing a dearth of sort of mid-career investigators, and it's not just Delaware. It's all sort of clinical academic environments and medical schools. There just aren't enough mentors. There aren't enough people who are senior, who have been through the ringer all the way up, and the people who are still who are available tend to be highly administratively encumbered because they're very senior. Middle people that we're missing. What do? So now we'll switch to the good things. So it's a problem, and it's a well-recognized problem nationally, and the CTRs and the CTSA programs have big components on mentoring education and career development and trying to develop things that we can do. And we really need to improve mentoring capacity at institutions, and we need to figure out ways to do that with the staff and structures that we have. One way, and something a lot of places are working on, including us, is mentor training. If you can increase the efficiency of mentoring, right? So there's an intervention that you're delivering by providing training for the senior people, and especially for those mid-career folks that are getting overwhelmed, you should be able to improve some of the problem. And I should say that one of the identified issues that comes out of the NIH analysis and some of the mentoring analysis is the junior investigator having problems because it's so complicated and they really need more mentoring and direction. The NIH has started to put significant resources into their websites to provide more information about how the process works and what you can expect at study sections. But from the academic and institutional perspective, we have to work in parallel. So in addition to trying to increase our capacity and providing training, a lot of what we're working on with CTR with MUSC is infrastructure. So if there are ways to provide support by developing an infrastructure that provides information, connections, that reduces the actual workload on the mentors and the mentees, that's an upside. If the mentee can get a lot of information delivered to them by senior people through an interface, that helps a lot. It relieves the burden on the mentors. And some of the infrastructure that we're building here and at other places are websites and toolkits. Sector is South Carolina Translational-Research Institute. We work with directly as a fantastic toolkit. And in Michigan also has one in their research institute. We're working on assessment tools, so in fact the system can tell if there's a breakdown rather than waiting for things to degrade. We're hosting best practices conferences, and we just held one. Tim and I just held one up here in April. I just attended one down in South Carolina. Try to harmonize or at least share information. So if we're going to invest in a program at Nemours that's over a 3-year time window, it'll cost X, and Sector already knows that that's not going to work. I want to know that before we put the money there. It's a zero-sum game. We want to be able to put the money where it's been. Working on providing training and educational opportunities, encouraging and facilitating peer groups, and that's both senior mentors and junior folks working together. And there's a dollar sign on this one. Trying to push resources in. So biostatistics had a little increase, just to emphasize it. But the time buyouts to relieve pressure on clinicians, pilot grants. I always say this in my talks, and it's the first time Bill's sitting here. There is a biostatistics, you guys all know this, in design and support mechanism for the CTR, which is a huge gift to the researchers in Delaware. Everyone should be taking advantage of it. And we have to push, which is strategically the hardest thing to accomplish. But we need to push institutions to a culture of mentoring and junior investigator support. I've had this conversation with multiple people in the room and with junior investigators at Nemours. Some of us who came through the system back in the heyday were sort of raised by wolves. Mentoring was you get thrown in the deep end of the pool, and if you could swim a little bit, then they'd help you, and that's how they filtered out who's the best person. But it was back in a day where the economics of biomedical research were completely different. So we don't want to we can't actually maintain that kind of mentoring approach, that mentoring culture, and things are moving very rapidly toward team structures and infrastructure support, especially at the largest academic medical institutions, with the CTSA grantees being leaders in that area. All right, so what is mentoring? There's definitions all over the place, and this is sort of my blah, blah, blah slide. So there's technical definitions of mentoring. For those of us who do it or are active in it, it's sort of you know it when you see it. But it really is about providing advice, counsel, and coaching. And here's the key part, to help individuals realize their full potential, right? So it's about helping someone figure out what it is they want to do, how they can attain those goals. And in some cases, mentoring isn't about helping, just in my case, helping a neurologist get a grant. It's about helping a neurologist realize they really want to be a clinician educator, and that they're struggling, and the reason they're not enjoying what they're doing is because it's not the thing they really want to do. But it's about helping people realize their full potential. By definition, there is no standard mentoring method. It's not a one-size-fits-all. These are individualized, again, I'll use the term interventions, that are, think individualized medicine. It's based on your patient or your mentee's particular needs and what needs to happen. Not a cloning experiment, not trying to make someone into you. In fact, I've had people tell me they don't want to be. Someone's probably listening to this. They're not your supervisor, your sponsor, but sort of a wise and trusted professional friend. who has multiple different roles and can act as a role model, advisor, counselor, teacher, advocate, protector. A lot of times, especially these days, one person can't do all those things. So mentor is now, rank doesn't mean automatically that you're effective mentoring, and we're working on training programs to make sure that effective mentoring can be delivered. And critical to mentoring relationships is that trainees have to be committed. And that's, in discussions I've had, that's one of the ways you can identify who's going to succeed. The ones who are committed to it, the ones that have the fire in their belly and the drive to do it and sort of get up. When they get their first pink sheets back, or they get the pink sheets are your critiques on your grant, or they get a review back from an editor or reviewer that's just scathing. It's what they do again. But mentees really have to, and trainees have to be active participants and make sure they communicate what they need. What are the benefits of mentoring? Right? So, and these are from the U.S. Office of Personal Management. There's a best practices session in 2008. But what mentoring has been shown to do is provide renewed enthusiasm for being in the role of the expert. It's a good thing for the senior person. These are based on comments from the mentoring sessions. The increased, from the mentor's perspective, there's an increased realization of what the challenges are for the junior faculty, both technical and sort of environmental in their careers. You improve your skills in coaching, counseling, listening, and modeling behaviors, which I hear a lot about. Not because I had modeled poorly, but because there's a big push at Nemours for these kinds of things in leadership development. That you develop and practice their style of leadership, able to demonstrate your expertise and shared knowledge. We all like to talk about what we know and what we do, and that's actually a huge benefit. And increased awareness of generational and sort of diversity-associated differences in how research is done and can be done. Here's a quote. Christine Funds has done a lot of recent research and actually puts numbers behind some of those qualitative assessments that were out there. But mentoring actually affects research productivity. It increases. It increases the quality and sort of satisfaction with quality of training for undergraduate students and fellows. And importantly, mentoring and having strong mentoring programs helps diversify the sciences. And diversity is actually, in research departments, is very closely linked to the quality of mentored research. In their ability at different institutions to attract underrepresented groups to science. And those are all wonderful things. And there's a generally accepted notion that mentoring is a great thing. We need to measure it more, and what aspects of mentoring really are effective needs to be measured more. At Nemours, we have split mentoring into 5 domains just to sort of specifically articulate and allow conversations between mentors and mentees and amongst mentors to focus on particular areas. So for new physicians coming into Nemours, these are the 5 areas that we try to link them with mentors, and it's not necessarily one person. Each institution has sort of their different best practices, and this is a relatively new kind of demarcation for us and how mentoring is split up. But work-life balance is actually a very big deal, actually something that's a much bigger impact, has a much bigger impact on success than I would have estimated earlier in my career. Getting a mentor for your leadership management skills, your educator expertise, your technical expertise, both clinical and research, and your overall comprehension of research planning and activities. So we think this is that isolating these areas and making sure that new physicians have support in all 5 is a best practice. At least we're proposing that it is in Nemours. And there's 3 key C's, and this, I don't even know where this came from, but confidence, and commitment that we look for in helping mentees and mentors match with each other. A lot of people use these categories. You need someone who's confident in the professional and personal skills, is confident and willing to share their network, kind of step back, let the junior person excel, sharing credit or giving credit. and is committed and has the time to invest in energy to mentoring and developing others. And as I mentioned earlier, finding people in all three of these categories with significant strengths is becoming much more difficult. The main issue, well, two main issues is one, there's fewer and fewer people, and they have less and less time. Time investment, even though the intent is there, the availability of time is limited. Apparently, there are only 24 hours in a day, and it doesn't matter how hard you work. So here's some best practices beyond what we were sort of trying to accomplish at Nemours. And these come from multiple different places. But best practices in mentoring are evaluated, and I'll show you, I think, the references on here next. But clarifying expectations with 3 exclamation points. One of the biggest things that you can do with a mentor-mentee dyad, or between a mentee and a team, so that everyone's very clear. When we're meeting, what we're talking about, what are the goals of this interaction. It really helps the mentees focus, and it allows the mentors to compartmentalize the interaction and what they're doing. We're focusing on getting the grant submitted, focusing on getting comments back from Dr. Gardner for this submission. That's what this interaction is about. Use a mentoring plan, which we're encouraging and trying to make consistent in the Delaware CTR, and even use. And a plan is sort of an iterative idea. We're gonna meet every other week at this time. We're gonna talk about this, and you go through and execute the mentoring plan, then adapt it as needed. And a compact. These are, at Nemours, the ones we have, and I can, if anyone's interested in seeing them, they sound kind of legal-ish. I think that's where we generated the original documents from. But in terms of articulating specifically what's going to happen, having a document that does that, and it can be simple, increases the satisfaction of both people on the mentoring interaction. It's surprising how many times the mentee and the mentor don't align, and as sort of a senior person at Nemours, you don't find out until the whole relationship is degraded and the mentee's thinking of leaving the institution. And you go and talk to the mentor, and they're like, I didn't know she was interested in that. And communication is key. The mentees have to, and the mentors too, do their homework between meetings and provide materials. If you're going to talk about a manuscript, make sure the mentor has the most recent draft and don't hand it to them as you're sitting down. Use an individual development plan and discuss it, and I'll show you a couple of examples of where you can find IDPs. And the mentees should keep notes and share them. And this all sounds a little bit kind of dry and sort of pro forma, and why doesn't everybody do this automatically? But the fact of the matter is a lot of people don't. And it's great. And so I have multiple mentees, and I encourage them to do that. Like, I have my notes. Sometimes my notes are very graphical, and if I'm in a different mindset when I look at them, I don't know what they say anymore. They summarize and email me and saying, hey, it was great talking to you. Here's what we decided to do. We're getting back together on July 6th or whatever it is. And I go, oh, I can't meet July 6th. We can clarify things right away.
What's the difference between a plan and a compact?
Compact, yeah, it's a good question. So a plan is going forward. It's very specific about we're going to meet every month, but you can change it. And we might merge the two documents together eventually. The compacts that are out there are much more, this is it. This is the agreement that we have. So they don't necessarily go into the level of detail. We're going to meet at 6 a.m. Before rounds every Wednesday, which the plan says. The compact says we're going to work on your NIH grant submission, which is due on October 2015, and sort of specifies the relationship. But you're right, there's subtle differences between the two, and maybe really it's just one thing that we need to work on putting together. Oh, I forgot to fix this. If someone knows how to change the color of these fonts on the PowerPoint, I meant to change it before I came because the little lavender doesn't show up very well on computer screens. And there's links behind it, that's why. So there's examples of mentoring compacts that the ACCEL program has, and they're available on the website. And the AAMC also has a compact that was primarily for postdocs and their mentors. And since that AAMC document was posted, a bunch of different places have taken it and modified it. Ours, the ACCEL one, is for faculty. specific faculty. There's also mentoring plans. Nemours has a mentoring plan system that's built into our performance management structure, so that when a physician goes in and they're reporting what they did, kind of their responsibilities over the quarter, there's actually a mentoring tab there for them to work with their mentors, and ACCEL has a version of it again on the website. And IDPs, so the individual development plans. AAAS has one, again, that's very focused on postdocs, where you, and the links built in here if you want the slides, Serapé has them. It does an inventory, what are you interested in, what do you want to be when you grow up, have questions, and then has a plan on top of that. And when this was first released, I don't know if it was even beta testing, I made one just to see what it looked like and how everything's in there, and I still, on a monthly basis, get an email reminder saying, hey, you need to update your individual development. And they're used in concert with the mentor. You usually have a primary mentor in the mentoring team. Just articulate, this is what I want to do. This is how, I see myself having an R01 in the next 5 years, and these are my short-term and long-term goals to get to that point. All right, so other best practices in working effectively so those are all things sort of for the mentees. Best practices that have come up, and these are the Abbott and Fleming articles. The Abbott article goes through the derivation of core competencies for mentors in clinical and translational research, and these are from their work in the order they present them. Communication, which we all know is huge, kind of just managing the relationship so it doesn't degrade. They rank sort of second, psychosocial support and work-life balance. And again, I've seen that as well, especially in the current clinical academic environment. To have in your mind that that's a focus of something you should ask people, which we all tend to do anyway, how are things, keeping track of how the mentee is doing. Career and professional development, which I think is automatic, although I would have guessed it would have been higher. Professional enculturation and scientific integrity and responsible conduct of research should be on the mentor's mind. Development and content mentoring, which is usually the first place we start. We look at the grant, we talk about the aims, we talk about how to better structure them. But that in their listing actually came out fifth. And then CTR is clinical and translational research, investigator development, and team science. We're moving more and more toward team science as the goal, the way research will be done, and making sure especially junior investigators are aware of that and are developing the skills necessary to be transdisciplinary. I'm going to skip this. I'm talking too slowly. It's one of the best practices that we're starting to push and realizing is early on, make sure that both sides understand relationships have trajectories, and it's not a big deal if we get to the point of accomplishing what we want to accomplish, that you will move on. It's not not something that is written in stone will always stay the same way. Most mentor-mentee relationships that are very strong last for a very long time, but the relationship becomes different. And articulating that early on and understanding what the stages are, and those are summarized here. When you get to stages, changing mentors is okay and not that unusual midstream. And this is from University of Oregon. All right, so what I want to get to in the last few minutes here are assessments. So I think everyone agrees mentoring is important. There are limited resources, and you can only do so much. So what actually counts as effective mentoring, and where should we be focusing? How do you assess an intervention like a mentoring, education, and career development program? And was the intervention, was it effective? And what does that mean? What does effective mean in the idea of you're helping an individual reach their potential? So for students, fellows, junior faculty, they reach their individual potential. Is that tenure and promotion? Is that what we should be looking at? And if we look at that, does it show us information about the mentoring programs at different institutions? The divisions, departments, institutions, they have their own goals. They want to be top 10, top 5, number 1 in some specific category. Is that external research dollars, a number of applications, increasing cost effectiveness, their profit margin? But the institution is, the main goal is to increase cost effectiveness in this division over time. Shouldn't the mentoring program actually feed into that? That's part of the idea, is that the whole system we're working on helps the individuals and ultimately the institutions reach what they need to do. I'm not saying we should. This is more of a question. And then overall, the system reaches its goals, right? There's improved health and reduced burden of illness. And those are trajectories that go out really far. But in all honesty, that's what we're trying to do as a community of researchers. And if there are programs that can help us get to that goal quicker and more cost effectively, we should use them, especially. And I just have, and I'm not going to go through the research here. There's online on a CTR website, Mark Chimowitz gave a talk in our Mentoring the Mentor program on effective mentoring and how you measure it. And I can send you the link, or Aaron Riegel can send you the link if you're interested in watching that. I recommend watching it. He's a national expert on these things. But there is research out there. So this study, this is from 2005, measuring the effectiveness of faculty mentoring relationships. It's primarily qualitative. There have been surveys. You'll see Mike Fleming and Christine Fohn come out quite a lot in this. They're from Madison, Wisconsin, and they've been pushing and sort of leading in the area of mentoring competency assessment tools and surveys and how you tell what's effective or not. So that's 2010. This is from Feldman et al. Looking at a mentor development program for clinical and translational science. And they're measured out were sort of improved confidence in mentoring skills. And I'll talk about another one that comes up where the structure of the research that's done on these interventions is still in its infancy, but you take an assessment for your mentoring skills, do an intervention, and then go back and take the same assessment. But we haven't yet tied to whether or not we're assessing the right things. So the interventions that we're looking at now increase your score on an assessment tool, but whether or not that's really impacting the actual measures. This is the Aberdeen work I mentioned earlier in one of the earlier slides about what competencies we should be defining and looking at for mentors. Characteristics of successful and failed mentoring relationships, largely qualitative stuff. And this is one of Mike Fleming's more recent ones that I just mentioned, the mentoring competency assessment tool, which is, we've taken their hard copy tool and put it into REDCap, and we're starting to use it. And in fact, Seema and I wrote a subcontract to an R25 to use that tool to at least look at the effectiveness of our mentoring programs. Waiting to hear about that. And then finally, the resources I've been mentioning throughout, but I wanted to provide you with the links. And they're specifically here. If you're not, and I would assume everyone in the room and probably online probably is registered on the ACCEL website, but I give similar talks to other people and encourage them to do that. It gives you access to a whole lot of resources, including the talks I was talking about, the tools and assessments, including that mentoring competency assessment tool. Aaron Riegel, who's listening, is the administrative coordinator for the Mentoring Education and Career Development core that the CTR is putting together. And she does that across. So she supports all 4 of the institutions. I didn't mention this, but the Med Zone is a room. You guys have a whole institute here. We have a room at Nemours that's dedicated to mentoring and education for junior faculty. In a way, its derivation is that we needed a place for them to hide. We needed a place for them to go and focus on research where they weren't in the clinic or in their clinical offices. Because we all know, even though you have research time, if you're there and there's a quick question, come take a look at this, could you sign that? So we put a specific place for them to come that has video linkages, computers, and we do teaching and actually mentoring across campuses. Mentoring plans can be found at these different sites, in IDPs. And then for Nemours in CTR more broadly, Bunnell's group is developing a profile system so that you can try to find, or you can eventually find reliably other people in Delaware, other people at the CTR institutions might be able to help you. Similar interests, similar technologies, similar analytical problems and questions that they have. And the CTR and CTSA programs have a broader initiative. I heard about it. I think Stuart told me it's called Vivo, where they're trying to do the same thing nationally. So we're trying to push those tools out and make more accessible ways for people to interact and get the mentoring and everything we need. I'm going to stop there. There are lots of areas I tried to touch on, but hopefully people got a sense from this talk of what the need really is. We need mentoring, what best practices currently are. I'll show you where the resources that you can find, but that there's an open question. We really need something, and Mark Chimowitz and I and others have talked about this. We need something like a clinical trial to be done to figure out if these interventions, some of which are pretty expensive and labor intensive, and the maintenance costs for them are not small. We need some kind of trial to figure out if what we're doing is being effective. So I thank you all for your attention. I look forward to any comments or questions you might have. Bill?
It was really, really very informative. Very informative. And I wonder your thoughts on the differences in mentoring between clinical research and laboratory-based research. Laboratory-based research today is almost entirely PhDs. They're really dependent on their research going forward and getting their grants, and they're going to be very focused on it, and they're going to stay there. Maybe they tool up into industry eventually, but they're going to stay there while they're pursuing their academic career. Clinical investigators, on the other hand, they're coming and going. They do a project, they may get funded, they go off and they're doing clinical work, they come back with a good idea occurs to them 3 years later. It's a very different career path. So I wonder your thoughts on mentoring such different people.
It's a great question. And sort of underlying that question is this idea, well, can a basic researcher in a university setting, not even at a medical school, help mentor a clinician scientist? Right, so for me, the logistics of whether or not that makes sense underlies that question. There are very, very different cultures that the investigators work in. There are very different pressures on them, different timelines to promotion, different things they need to do to move on. So the content or the information that needs to be communicated and sort of the level, sort of 30,000-foot view that air cover, I don't know why that term is the term I've been using, to make sure that they're moving in the right direction. Those are very different ideas. But as far as we can tell, or as far as I can tell, the strategy, how you do that, is the same. It's still about the mentor-mentee relationship. It's still about identifying a mentor who's got the time and the resources to help the individual. There are fewer of those in the clinical side, and I think it's going to get sparser. So part of our training initiative is to make, in this idea of harmonizing the cultures, is to make the basic researchers who have an interest in translational medicine or translational research more cognizant and more sort of able to mentor across academic discipline. But it's a great question. It's part of the underlying problem that we face in the mentoring community. And really the upshot is we need senior people that know the ropes. And even within a clinical environment, there's multiple different outcomes in cardiology is different than orthopedic surgery, right? There's what you need to tell those folks in terms of what they need to do to advance are different things. But the strategies, I think, are the same. And I think with more cross-cultural pollination and more training programs for mentors, we can increase the capacity to help. But I think it's a great question.
You know, for our Value Institute younger investigators, SEMA obviously played a key role. Bill and Paul and Zugway and others, and in particular, the availability of Sandy Schwartz here 2 or 3 or 4 times a month has been very helpful. And also, Sandy has been working a lot with the Value Institute scholars, the sort of clinicians who are hoping to have a component of research, clinical research in their careers. We don't have the structure here of sort of traditional academic departments. We don't have the we haven't yet established the metrics for how we're going to be successful as a value institute in terms of publications and presentations and so on. We're in a slightly different space, but I think that the environment that we have and the accessibility of people like Bill and others, is what we should be. We may not be able to say this is my primary mentor, but that we have individuals among us who are able to promote our respective academic or research efforts. I know that the CTR, the purpose of the CTR, one of the purposes of CTR is to promote federally funded research, and NIH is paying for the CTR, so they're obviously focused on NIH funding, but we know, especially in terms of the work we're doing up here, that there are other funding agencies, ARC and Tory and so on, and CDC for one of our scholars. So, we have to sort of adjust our expectations a little bit, but the importance, I think what you're stressing is the importance of this relationship for the mentee and the importance of having committed wise men, mentors.
It's critically important, and just in addition to that, infrastructure, especially in Delaware, that allows us to work across the campuses. Yeah. So, a clinician here, I have a lung and blood funded project actually looking at vein grafts. Pediatrics, they do surgeries, and you see something similar, and the sort of folks that are working on that project, now that we're moving preclinical or pediatric cardiac surgeons, but really, I should reach out and figure out ways to do that effectively. And I've talked to Bill about that. Well, who's got the most experience here? This is what we're thinking, what we're trying to do. We all think it's a great idea. But if there are collaborators here and there's clinicians here whose goal is to collaborate on research, they don't want to be a PI. They want to do research and not have to write the grants and collaborate on projects of interest to them, that I think there are lots of opportunities for that. I'm a faculty in engineering school. There are engineers that are dying to figure out how to apply their methodologies or their approaches to clinical problems. So part of the infrastructure between CTR and INBRE we're trying to build is to make that work.
Very, very important, but a great opportunity for us, especially Christiana.
So in that regard, I'd like to emphasize also that a mentor does not have, for the mentee, it does not necessarily have to be a mentor. Rather, you need mentoring. And that may involve several different kinds of people. So you may have project mentors, career mentors, and also a national mentor. As people begin to grow, that national mentor can ultimately be the most important person of all, because that's the person that ultimately helps open doors.
The average is for major sort of clinical academic institutions, average for junior work. That's not that idea that clinician scientists are sort of self-assembling these teams. We're talking about smart people across the board, right? Basic scientists and clinical scientists. The clinician scientists, they've already learned, and when we finally started to look, that they need teams and that they need to reach out nationally. Doing that ad hoc is really labor intensive and fraught with sort of difficulties in finding the wrong person. So at Delaware, through the Delaware CTR, I'm hoping we can have a better umbrella program that allows us to make those connections. But I agree with that. Strategically, it's getting that's your goal is to be R01 funded, nationally recognized researcher in this field, having someone that has done that, and they don't have to be sitting in the room or sitting in Delaware. They just have to be willing to deliver the mentoring and to work together with whatever team that the
I was really curious. I like to see how you broke them out into domains as well. I feel like that could be a key way for people to kind of hone in on this idea that what's really required is multiple mentors and not a single one. And actually, in one of the studies I helped Seema with, we found some people in academic medicine had as many as 7 mentors. That was obviously on the opposite end of the spectrum, but.
You get curious about those folks sometimes. Like 70
Yeah.
seems high.
Yeah. But I think like kind of, well, I think also one of the things we found was there's this concept like that formal traditional mentoring relationship, but there's also the more informal one where it can involve mentoring with peers as well. But I think, like you said, like a framework and a structure and kind of putting it to those domains can help people realize that you don't need to get one resource from one.
Yeah. There's literature on these pods, peer on-site distant mentoring ideas. I don't know if anyone's really codified that or set a program around peer on-site distance. But that's, having peer mentoring groups is again something we're trying to stimulate with the CTR fund. Fantastic. Big upside. It's depressing to someone like me that I can just sit there with a bunch of peers and they solve all the problems and actually come up with what I would have said from the beginning. So you kind of get this sense, well, they don't really need me, which is why you went to the meeting. But the take home is the peer interactions are hugely successful. It's so beneficial for people who are just getting started to, one, hear that other people are having the same problem, and two, if I figured out 10% of it, and you figured out 20% of it, and someone else figured out 25% of it, and we only overlap a little bit and we get together, we're approaching 50% of having those occasions and sort of the infrastructure around allowing the information flow, right? So getting information from the mentors to the mentees, from the mentees to each other, to me, that's all about infrastructure. How do you make that happen? How do you make that accessible and easy for people to do? But yeah, I agree. Seven's a lot.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? If you don't have any now and you have things you want to contact me about, I would be happy. It would be wise to CC Sarah Fay or Aaron Riegel